Right, so that was qualifying at Suzuka round 4 of the 2024 season. And yeah, I want to get straight into it. Quick track trivia. Figure 8 circuit, 5.8 kilometers. Your full throttle for 64% of the lap. Track lap record is Sebastian Vettel in 2019 with the 127.064, 18 turns and 40 meters of elevation, which has to be one of the highest on the calendar. And just one DRS zone. So yeah, real driver circuit. As far as tire compounds, Pirelli brought the hardest tires of this of the range. The C1 being the hard, the C2 the medium, and the C3 is the soft. Which last race weekend at Australia, the C3 was the hard. So very hard tires brought to Suzuka, and you need them because of the massive aerodynamic load through a lot of these corners. Yeah, and before I get into Q1, I just want to say it was really nice just to see the fans. Probably some of the best out of any circuit, just very respectful, and seeing their dedication and passion for Formula One is amazing. And yeah, it's hard to imagine a calendar without Suzuka or any race in Japan. So yeah. And another thing, happy birthday to Oscar Piastri, who turned 23 qualifying Saturday. Yeah, so getting into Q1, Kevin Magnussen of Haas was the first one out, and I thought the cameras did a good job with his onboard. They had that moving camera bit, and it just shows how Sector 1 is purely instinct. Yeah, so K Mag was the first to go out in Q1. George Russell had a moment with Oscar Piastri coming out of his garage in the pit lane. Very easily could have been a big accident. I think Piastri he might have brushed the wall a bit. Um, didn't have damage as far as we could tell, but yeah, those incidents coming out of the pit lane when the driver's leaving his garage, they're so frustrating because they're they could be completely avoided. I understand the team's not wanting to go out early in the session because of track evolution, but at the same time, you really don't want to damage your car in the pit lane or even get a grid penalty for dangerously leaving your garage. And it can be avoided. Just leave your garage when there's no other cars out on track. Sure, the track may not have as much grip, but at the same time, you just want to avoid these silly, unnecessary, stressful errors. And unfortunately, these clumsy, unforced errors just seem to be more and more common from Mercedes. Um, I just finished watching qualifying. It'll be interesting to see if George Russell has received a grid penalty for dangerously leaving his garage, but that's one of those things where say full blame on Mercedes for not safely releasing their cars, and Lewis Hamilton was right ahead of George Russell. So even if you take George Russell out the equation with Piastri, um, Lewis probably would have rather dangerously cut off Oscar. So yeah, Max, who would later get his 36th career pole, was the quickest in Q1 after the first runs with 10 minutes to go. Interesting to see Lando Norris go airborne at the final chicane, where you could still see him fighting the steering midair as none of his tires, or if I'm not sure if all his tires were off at that final chicane, but yeah, just seeing him airborne was quite something to see. Just taking a bit too much curb. Uh, yeah. Um, Anyways, let's get into drivers who got knocked out in Q1. P20, you had Zhou Guanyu with the 130.143. P19, you had Logan Sargent once again getting out qualified by his teammate Alex Albon. P18 was Kevin Magnussen. P17 was Pierre Gasly. And P16 was Lance Stroll, who was nearly 8 tenths off the pace of his teammate Fernando Alonso. And Stroll was 61 hundredths off Alex Albon in P15. So, yeah, 5 different teams out in Q1. You had the Aston Martin of Lance Stroll, the Alpine of Pierre Gasly, the Haas of Kevin Magnussen, the Williams of Logan Sargent, and the Sauber of Zhou Guanyu. Um, yeah, Logan slower than Alex Albon again. Um, it really seems like Logan's confidence is taking a big hit. And he was really just hanging on. He's been outpaced every weekend by Alex Albon since joining Formula One in 2023, and it would seem that his time might be coming to an end at Williams soon. Whether at this point it just seems a matter of when, not necessarily if. You have to wonder, will it be around the summer break, or is Williams going to let him finish out the season because of the funding that Logan brings? But that's an interesting story to watch for sure. Yeah, Lance Stroll 8 tenths off his teammate Fernando Alonso. That's tough. Not really much to say. I mean, Fernando was brilliant today. Um, Getting the absolute maximum out of the car at all times, right from the very beginning. But man, you have to wonder how much longer is Lance going to be in Formula One? Is his dad just going to keep with the project and just keep giving his son a seat? Or is one day he going to realize, hey, Lance, you're not where we need you to be. You're costing us a massive amount of points, and I'm sorry, but your time is up, and maybe you can go do something else. So yeah, massively disappointing day for Lance to be 8 tenths off the pace of his teammate Fernando Alonso, who would make it into Q1. Pierre Gasly, who was complaining about traction, once again was out qualified by Esteban Ocon. Ocon now has a 4-0 advantage over Gasly, which to me is kind of surprising because I would rate Gasly as having more pace than Ocon. Not because Esteban's a bad driver, but he's kind of an animus one, where he's kind of doesn't really have anything about him that stands out. But he's doing a good job on Pierre Gasly, in an Alpine that is very difficult to drive. So yeah, Max was quickest in Q1, nearly 4 tenths clear of Alonso in P2. Max had a 128.866, which was quicker than his pole time in 2023 here at Suzuka. So yeah, that was Q1. Stroll in P16, P17 Pierre Gasly, P18 was Kevin Magnussen, P19 was Logan Sargent, and P20 was Zhou Guanyu. Q2, Red Bull were the first cars to leave the garage, which is good to see. Always get to avoid those unnecessary pit lane incidents, and you get the track to yourself. After the first run, Sergio Perez, who drove brilliantly all day today, after struggling so much here in Suzuka, just what was it, a little over 6 months ago in September 2023. After the first runs in Q2, Perez was just 12 hundredths off Max, so Red Bull would have been very happy with that. It was interesting seeing Lando Norris all throughout qualifying. He was very narrow out of that final turn, which is a right-hander medium speed corner after the chicane, where you're looking to get a good run on the start finish straight with DRS, but at the same time you can't get too eager. And some drivers were taking a wider line, but Norris was like really taking it very narrow, minimizing the distance he had to take to the start finish straight at the expense of a bit more steering he was entering. So interesting to see the different lines at the final turn. And another thing from I was the cameras on the F1 TV broadcast, excuse me, showed Charles Leclerc a bit driving today, and I noticed uh his left what's that? The left wing mirror, his left mirror. Anyways, the left mirror on the car of Leclerc, it seemed to be a lot looser than usual. I wonder if any of the teams will be mentioning anything about that, or if Ferrari picked up on that. Um, just something I noticed. With all these talks of flexi wings and stuff, I wouldn't be surprised if um, flexi mirrors would be brought up. It was also interesting on the topic of Ferrari. It was interesting to see the camera show Antonio Giovinazzi with 8 minutes left to go in Q2. Haven't heard too much about Gio, but it's good to see him. And supposedly, he's a very good sim driver, as Sebastian Vettel has been on the record of giving a lot of praise towards Antonio. Yeah, so after the first runs in Q2, Max was the quickest. Sergio Perez was right behind. Nico Hulkenberg and Alex Albon had track times deleted because of track limits. Or they had lap times deleted because of track limits. Carlos Sainz, who drove really well today and would outqualify his teammate Charles, he was complaining about soft pedals in Q2. Um, Definitely not ideal. And also, how could we forget Yuki Tsunoda's home race? He had massive support today, and he had a lot of family members in the garage, which is good to see for Yuki, who I think is driving better than he ever has. And um, yeah, I don't think he's also necessarily getting the recognition he deserves for doing such a good job on Ricardo, because I think when Ricardo came into the Alpha Tauri, it was almost assumed that Daniel would just be the quicker driver and he would be taking Sergio Perez's seat. Looking back, that seems kind of foolish. Daniel's not necessarily getting dominated by Yuki, but he's getting beaten by Yuki, and Yuki would out qualify Ricardo today, and he now has a 4-0 advantage on Ricardo. So while the gaps may not be massive at the end of the day, the advantage and the outperformance that Sonoda has done on Ricardo is substantial and decisive. The top seven for in Q2, they decided to not do a second run. They decided to stay in the pit lane. So you had spots 8 through 15 vying to make it into the Q3 shootout, while the top seven decided to stay in the garage. And yeah, let's get into Q2 eliminations. In P15, you had the Alpine of Esteban Ocon, who was 4 tenths off Yuki Tsunoda, who knocked out his teammate Daniel Ricciardo for that final P10 spot to get into Q3. P14, you had Alex Albon, who was 3 tenths off of Yuki Tsunoda in P10. P13, you had the Sauber Valtteri Bottas, who was just under 2 tenths off of Tsunoda. P12, you had Nico Hulkenberg, who was 77 hundredths off Yuki Tsunoda. And P11, you had Daniel Ricciardo, who was 55 hundredths off Yuki Tsunoda, so a little over half a tenth. And yeah, a disappointing day for Daniel Ricciardo. Not because his performance was really bad, but just for him to narrowly miss out to his teammate Yuki Tsunoda, who, like I said, I think many others would have thought before 2024 started, if you would have told Daniel that, hey, after 4 rounds, you'll have been out qualified by Yuki and comprehensively outperformed by Tsunoda, I don't think many people would have taken that claim serious, and I don't think Daniel would have believed that. Yeah, he's had some bad lucks like spins, slow pit stops, damage, and what have you, but Yuki's doing a better job in qualifying, and Ricardo really needs to turn it around because ever since leaving Renault in 2020, his McLaren stint, while it had some good moments, I would say got worse the longer it went on. 2021, there was definitely some rough patches, but he still won in Monza, and he had some decent performances here and there, albeit there was some shockers as well. But 2022, I don't really remember there being too many highlights. It seemed like it got worse than 2021 as far as his gaps to Norris were concerned. So yeah, 5 different teams out in Q2. You had the Visa Cash App Racing Bull of Daniel Ricciardo, the Haas of Nico Hulkenberg, the Sauber of Valtteri Bottas, the Williams of Alex Albon, and the Alpine of Esteban Ocon. And yeah, that was a good lap for Yuki to do it right when he needed it. And I think he would have been very disappointed to have not made Q3, especially to just lose out to his teammate, Daniel. So I think him and his family will be very happy with their performance today, and they'll be looking to leave Japan with some points come Sunday. Oh yeah, and before Q2, Max was the quickest with the 128.740, and his teammate Sergio Perez was just 12 hundredths off with the 128.752. So now we move on to Q3. Um, Lewis Hamilton was one of the first to set his laps, and the Mercedes has been a very tricky car to drive. Um, on the start finish straight, their top speed wasn't bad. Lewis was doing 319 kilometers per hour heading into turn one, which is pretty decent. And yeah, um, as far as Charles Leclerc, he was a driver who had a bit of a day to forget today. He only did one run, and when the other 9 drivers, when Q3 started, the other 9 drivers did their first runs. Leclerc waited after the other 9 drivers were done to leave the pit lane, and he set his quickest lap. He only went out once, but didn't seem to be quite so settled today, as Leclerc would only qualify 8th. He was behind his teammate Carlos Sainz. But yeah, we'll get back to Ferrari later. But anyways, the story of Q3 is Max Verstappen would take pole with the 128.197. Yeah, it was a brilliant lap from Max, and I think a big story too was just how close his teammate Sergio Perez was. Checo was a little over half a tenth behind Max, and I think that was very unexpected because for Sergio to be so close to Max at any circuit is kind of a bit of a surprise. But Suzuka, I think, is the circuit you would least expect a driver like Sergio Perez to be so quick at. With it being such a driver's heavy circuit, and you need to be so fluid and what's the word I'm looking for? Precise while not going over the limit. Yeah, and Sergio Perez traditionally hasn't been the best at Suzuka, but for him to be, within a tenth of his teammate, I think Red Bull will be very happy with that. So yeah, Perez P2 as Red Bull lock out the front row. P3 was the McLaren of Lando Norris, who was just under 3 tenths behind Max. A good day for Lando. Um, yeah, I think Norris starting third. I think he'll look to get a podium tomorrow. Um, and as far as McLaren, I think it was kind of hard to read before qualifying started exactly where they were at. They kind of seem to be underperforming, but I think this will be one of their strongest circuits for a while, and I don't think they'll be quicker than Ferrari very often moving forward. I say that to mention that before the upgrades start coming in, it is reported that McLaren have a big upgrade package coming no later than Spain and Barcelona in June. But before the upgrades come in, I don't think McLaren will be quicker than Ferrari. I think Shanghai will go back to seeing Ferrari being quicker. It could be closer, but I think Ferrari will have the advantage when we come to China. But Suzuka, initially, I had the McLaren being the second quickest team ahead of Ferrari. I don't think that will be the case in China, where I think McLaren will probably be third quickest, but it'll be interesting to see. And P4, Carlos Sainz, who had a bit of an underrated day, but for him to be on the second row, um, I think Ferrari will be pretty happy with that, even if Sainz was just under 5 tenths off the pace of Max Verstappen for pole. And yeah, it was actually really close between Sainz and P5, his fellow Spaniard Fernando Alonso. Just 4 thousandths in it between them, as Alonso did a fantastic job to get that Aston Martin up into fifth on the grid at the circuit that he declared as his favorite. Yeah, a bit of a underrated day for Alonso. Um, Once again, he's carrying Aston Martin. Uh, Points seem very, I'd say, quite unlikely for Lance Stroll, with overtaking being as difficult as it is at Suzuka. And when you're looking to make up places at a circuit like Suzuka, I think it's very easy to go over the limit, um, or just have a tough race when you're probably going to have to try an alternate strategy. And just, the race starts are so key here with overtaking being so difficult. Lap one is extremely important, and all the drivers around Lance Stroll, who will be starting 16th, have that same mindset of Lance, of them wanting to make up positions. And equally, those drivers around him won't have as much to lose as he does. So, yeah, Alonso with another brilliant job, uh, qualifying P5 ahead of the McLaren of Oscar Piastri in P6, who was about a little under 3 tenths of his teammate Lando Norris. Um, Bit of an uneventful day for Oscar. Um, yeah, P6 on his birthday. Um, I think maybe he can move forward, get a top five, but yeah, just kind of a dull day for Oscar. But it's good for him to be bringing in solid points and for him to be ahead of the competitors, specifically the Ferrari of Charles Leclerc and their factory supplier, their engine supplier of Mercedes. P7, you had Lewis Hamilton, who had a bit of well, I think was frustrated. His race engineer Peter Bonington informed him about him being 5 tenths off the pace of Max Verstappen, and Lewis sounded very dejected. And I think he's just over this season. But I must say, I'm surprised with all that. I think he's driven really well this weekend, and I must say, I'm pretty surprised for him to outqualify George. Because in theory, I don't think Suzuka, when I think of Lewis's strongest circuits, Suzuka doesn't really come to mind. For me, I would say it's Budapest, Montreal, Silverstone, and probably Hungary, Canada, Silverstone, and honestly, Australia, Albert Park. But yeah, I think for Lewis to outqualify George, um, who up before this qualifying started, outqualified Lewis 3-0. I think Lewis, while he won't get as much satisfaction from beating George as I'm sure Russell does from beating his teammate Lewis Hamilton, I think he'll leave today knowing that he probably got the best out of his car. And honestly, I think he just wants to get the season over. P8 is Hamilton's future teammate for 2025, Charles Leclerc, who is right up there with Lewis, locking out that fourth row. And yeah, a bit of a struggle for Leclerc. Like I said, I just finished qualifying. I'm not sure what sort of issues there was, but yeah, it's strange this whole Ferrari situation with Sainz leaving, and it's kind of also unfortunate for Carlos because I think him having these. I know Leclerc's had bad luck in 2024 with his brake issues at Bahrain. But Albert Park, Sainz was simply quicker, and I think Suzuka is more of the same. Um, and yeah, I think Sainz needed these kind of performances where he genuinely outpaces Leclerc without any funny stuff going on, like grid penalties or anything like that. He needed these kind of weekends when the Ferrari was a title capable car in 2022. And ultimately, I think Ferrari's decision to not extend Sainz was a big part of that was Carlos's performances in 2022 when Leclerc was the one taking the fight to Max, and oftentimes Carlos Sainz was nowhere to be found. But yeah, Sainz is driving better than he ever has, and for him to be outpacing Leclerc at a circuit like Suzuka, I would say is pretty unexpected. Because if you remember in 2023, this is where Leclerc, after Ferrari did the floor update, Leclerc would go on to outqualify Sainz in every single race from Suzuka 2023 onwards. And yeah, when I think of Charles Leclerc circuits, Suzuka, I would have thought he would have had the advantage up on Sainz, but Carlos did a very good job today. And yeah, um, the advantage wasn't massive as Sainz was only a tenth and 4 thousandths ahead of Leclerc, but that tenth advantage over Leclerc is a 4 grid difference in starting spots. P9 was the other Mercedes of George Russell, who to my eye never seemed to be quite settled in this weekend. Um, yeah, sad situation at Mercedes, and you kind of have to feel for George because I think when he went to the team in 2022, Mercedes was off the run of being the constructors champion for 8 seasons in a row from 2014 to 2021. It was just assumed that Mercedes would be winning races and competing for titles, but that's not what's transpired in these ground effect regulations. Um, and yeah, they seem to be firmly in the midfield now. It just seems to be getting worse and worse. Excuse me. Hopefully, they can find something to be competitive in these ground effect regulations, but I kind of think that they're already putting all their chips in for the 2026 regs. So yeah, um, yeah, George was around 2.5 tenths slower than his teammate Lewis in P7. So a day to forget for Mercedes, but I suppose it's better than what happened in Australia when both cars DNF. And for George to, I guess you could call this a bounce back, but for him to, and it's really sad with Mercedes how P9 is seen as um, success, I guess if you could call it that. But hey, um, yeah, just strange days at Mercedes. Um, the slowest car in Q3 was the Japanese native of Yuki Tsunoda with the 129.413. Been in no man's land as he was 4 tenths off the pace of George Russell in P9 and over a second off the pace of Verstappen. But yeah, Yuki's driving amazing, and I think he'll be very pleased. Him and his family and the supporters will be very pleased to see him make it into Q3 and be doing such a good job on Daniel Ricciardo. So yeah, that was qualifying at Suzuka. Max Verstappen will get his 36th career pole of his career, and that's quite mind-boggling to think because it just seems like yesterday he got his first pole at Hungary 2019. But now, not only is he racking up race wins, but he's racking up these pole positions. And he was already winning a lot of races when he wasn't getting pole, primarily from uh, qualifying rounds when Charles Leclerc would get pole. But now he's getting poles, and when Max is on pole, you can pretty much say goodbye to the race. So yeah, also 4 poles in 4 rounds, so very impressive. Um, and I want to get into Max's lap real quick before I end this video. His sector 1 was a 30.777. His sector 2, which was slower than Sergio Perez, surprisingly, was a 39.850. And Max Verstappen sector 3 was a 17.570. So a really well balanced lap. Um, yeah, just very well managed. And I think the start will be very interesting to see. Um, I have a hard time imagining a scenario where Max is not in the lead by turn one in the S's, but you never know what could happen. Um, yeah, I think just a very good day for Red Bull, which is interesting because amidst all the controversies of the Horner scandal, they they're just firing on all cylinders. Yes, I suppose you could say the advantage is getting smaller, primarily in qualifying, but yeah, by seeing their form on track, you would never know that there's so much drama behind the scenes. So yeah, um, that was qualifying at Suzuka 2024, round four of the 2024 season. A pretty good session. I would say there was a good bit amount of surprises, and just seeing the drivers and qualifying at Suzuka as quick as they'll be throughout the entire weekend was just amazing. A weekend where you really appreciate the skills of the drivers and the lack of form becomes painfully obvious at a circuit like Suzuka. So yeah, that was qualifying, and I will be back with the race review. All right, guys, it was Paradise Flow. Be safe.